Most podcasters create amazing content that nobody finds. They interview high-profile guests, promote all day and night, and yet the show is stuck with slow and steady podcast growth. But look, there's a strategy that can change everything. So 2 years ago, I went to the London podcast show. Now in my mind, I thought I'm going to go there to network, to interview some big names, to grab some content. I even decided to put on a barcode on the front of my shirt as well as my business partners, because I thought, you know what, that would be good marketing. Anyways, whilst we were there, it was completely packed with a bunch of podcasters, some who are barely growing and others who were getting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and even millions of downloads per month. So I thought, you know what, why not go out there and ask a bunch of entrepreneurs with podcasts how they're growing their shows and what specific action they take that they feel is overlooked by other podcasters. Now I came across these two ladies who were the hosts of a very popular podcast called the Self-Care Club. They were getting, I believe, over 100,000 monthly downloads per month after podcasting for a couple of years. Now to me that was huge. So I asked them, look, what the hell is the secret behind your massive growth and popularity? Now what they said completely shocked me, and I'll be honest with you, I was very surprised. Up until this point I was getting surface level advice: post more consistently, publish great content, promote on social media, all the stuff we've all heard 1,000 times, and all the things most podcasters do but still struggle to grow. Now what the host of the Self-Care Club shared with me was massive. They said this. They mentioned how they always created and covered timely and highly relevant content for their audience. Now in my mind I was like, cool, that sounds fantastic, sounds cool, but what the hell does that actually mean? So I asked them, and they went on to explain how, when they first got started with their show, they just covered topics that they thought their audience would love. They covered topics based on ideas, based on, interviews they might have with another guest. They invited guests on, and then the guest talks about self-care and a bunch of different topics. But essentially it was based on what they liked and what they wanted to talk about. Now for them, where they had a massive pivot was when they started creating what they call timely and highly relevant content. And they mentioned how every January they noticed a trend that they would get a massive influx of downloads to their podcast. Now of course for them, their podcast was all about self-care, which kind of aligns with most people's New Year's resolution about self-love, self-confidence, self-care. So it was only natural that around that time their podcast, which is all about self-care, had a natural uptick. So they had the idea, why don't we start creating more timely relevant content? Why not every January we create very specific content targeting New Year, New Me, how to reinvent yourself, self-care routines for 2025, and create very specific content that allowed them to tap into the demand that was already there. Because whether or not they liked it, every January there was a massive demand for their topic. So they became way more intentional. They started tapping into other trends, like when it's coming up to summer, what a trend that their audience who are into self-care might be exploring. So again, they made very specific topic focused around summer, and then of course focused around winter as well. They also looked at trending topics in their space. What were the big news that was going on around that time within self-care, and how can they relate those massive news events back to their podcast and make it relevant to their audience they want to reach? Now when they said this, I was like, wow, that makes so much sense, because most podcasts, how they create content is essentially by going based off how they feel, or going based off essentially the guest and what the guest feels. And they spend hours creating the perfect episode thinking that's going to drive more growth, but it rarely does. Whereas smart podcasters, like the host of the Self-Care Club, they realize something very important. Instead of them just creating content based off their own ideas, they can simply look at the demand, pinpoint the hot and trending topics in their industry right now. They can then create targeted content, allowing them to be front and center for those conversations, which is huge, because no longer do they need to kind of try to go out there and try to find new listeners. They can simply create the content and have the listeners find them, because if they spoke about the January reset, the perfect self-care club for 2025, and it's January 1st, well guess what? New listeners are already typing in and searching on Apple and Spotify, are already looking for these types of content. So when the podcast shows up as a result, they discover the show, click play, binge, and become a long-term listener of the podcast. Now, this strategy, where we pinpoint hot and trending topics in an industry, is what we call newsjacking. Simply put, newsjacking is the art of tying your podcast content to timely and relevant topics going on in your industry right now. I'm talking about big news stories, viral moments, cultural shifts and conversations. It's how you're able to tap into massive visibility and get instant discoverability, because people are already searching for these types of topics. It's kind of like surfing a wave. You don't create a wave, you ride a wave. You see a wave in the background, holy crap, there's a massive trend, there's a cultural moment, this is massive currently in my space, and then all you've got to do is ride that wave, right? Just ride the wave by covering those trending topics on your show. And in doing so, you'll get exposed to a new audience who never knew of you before. And when you're able to tie back these trending topics to your podcast and tie it in a way that's highly relevant for your audience, because again, you don't want to just cover the news just because the news is on. It does need to have high relevancy to your audience. When you do this, you get free traffic, new listeners, and higher engagement without relying on social media or high profile guests. It's just you covering topics, riding that wave. Now look, I know you're probably thinking, and this sounds great, it sounds fantastic, I get it, but what does this look like practically? So in this video, I'm going to break down how you can start newsjacking to drive way faster podcast growth and drive your engagement way higher. And a starting point is by showing you some examples. So here's some examples to make this way more real. A mental health podcaster didn't just talk about, let's say, anxiety, which was the core topic for a podcast. She released an episode on how to manage anxiety during the LA wildfires. Because of course there are thousands of stressed out Californians searching for this type of content. Again, it's trending, it's topical, it's cultural, and it's highly relevant to a lot of her audience. A fitness coach didn't just talk about, let's say, weight loss, but they did an episode on the truth about Ozempic. Should you take it? And they do this right as a drug starts to trend. Or a business podcaster who didn't just talk about entrepreneurship. He actually broke down what Sam Altman's firing teaches us about leadership when OpenAI's CEO drama was all over the news. That's just an example. These are just examples, right? So those are some theoretical examples. For you, it's going to be something totally different. And later on in this video, I'm going to break down exactly how you can find these trending topics for your niche. But right now, I want to show you the real power of newsjacking and how powerful this can be to drive way more growth for your podcast. This is a real life example of a client who's used a strategy consistently to grow her podcast. So as you can see, we have the earliest episode down below right here, and we have the most latest episode at the top. Now, before she did a newsjacking episode, she was averaging 140 downloads per episode. And then she did a episode all about specifically 5-minute meditation to ease anxiety and cultivate compassion for LA wildfires. And all of a sudden, she went from averaging 140 downloads per episode to getting 216 downloads for this particular episode. Again, it was a breakthrough newsjacking episode. But what was more important was after she'd done this strategy, a lot of her listeners were retained. So it wasn't that she just had this massive influx of new listeners, she actually retained a percentage of her audience. Now you can see here, she then got 146 downloads for the next episode, which is also about coping with the stress of LA wildfires. The next one was 156, and then the one after that was 186. So after the newsjacking episode, more of her listeners started listening to future content. So here's another example. She did an episode where she was covering election anxiety, 3 coping skills to stay calm in a divided nation, right when election was taking place. Now what's going to happen? Well, everyone's stressed out, everyone's pulling out their hair, they're super amped up, and they see this title, or they're looking for ways to manage stress, ways to cope for stress, and then they see an episode that was highly relevant, highly targeted to their situation. So what happens? She went from averaging 129 downloads per episode before her breakthrough newsjacking episode was released, to then releasing the episode, which got 260 downloads for that particular episode, which is like more than double what she's used to. And then afterwards, which again, which is super important, I want to stress this, it wasn't that she just did this strategy and it worked, kind of. No, she did a strategy, got more exposure, and then of course her average downloads per episode increased. The next episode got 177, then 147, then 173, and then 151. The point is, there's a dramatic difference when she did a newsjacking episode and then the consecutive episodes she released afterwards. She kept those listeners coming back for more and grew her podcast month after month. This really was the results within 120 days of applying the strategy, because you're leveraging a trending topic in your industry, you're making it highly relevant to your audience, you're then creating future content that's highly targeted to that specific listener. So for our client, her podcast was all about calming anxiety and having the right coping coping skills through midlife. So she made an episode tapping into conversations that were already happening in her industry. Stuff like the LA wildfires, stuff like the election, and making those topics highly relevant to her audience. So the question then becomes, well, how can you do the same for your podcast? Well, number one, just start monitoring trends, right? Use the sources below to identify breaking news, viral conversation, and industry trends. You have Google Trends, Twitter X, Reddit threads, and hot posts on Reddit, news aggregators, industry blogs, trade publications, YouTube trending tab, podcasts in your niche. There's going to be a plethora of different sources that you can start to leverage to start tapping into these hot and trending topics. Step number two, identify relevant angles for your niche, right? Because not every trending topic is worth you covering. So let's say, for example, my client just covered the election and talked about news and gossip, but didn't relate it to her audience and the topic of her show. That actually damages her brand and has no relevancy to her audience. She needed to tie a link between election and her podcast, which is all about calming anxiety. And that's how she came up with the angle of coping skills to help you calm your anxiety during election time. You see how this is getting very creative, but how we link the trending topic to your podcast, to your audience. So what does this look like for you? Well, ask yourself, right? Does this relate to my niche? Can I add a unique perspective that no one else has mentioned? Will my audience care about this? If they don't care about it, just don't do it. You're wasting your time, you're wasting your audience time. And then finally, can I connect this to something evergreen? And what this simply means is making sure that when you talk about the trending topic, it is highly relevant to your overall podcast topic. So when a flood of new listeners come in, they love the trending topic episode, the newsjacked episode, they look through your back catalog and they can binge your entire back catalog because it's all highly relevant to them. If they came in, saw that you have this incredible trending topic that you gave great insights on, let's say about anxiety, and then looked through your back catalog and it was all about fitness and motivational speakers, well, they came in because they were anxious and they have anxiety problems, and now they're talking about fitness and motivational speakers. There's a disconnect, so they leave and never return. Same when you post future content. If your future episodes aren't highly targeted to their specific pain points, they've come, love the episode about anxiety, but in your future content, if it's not highly relevant and again in alignment with the overall podcast, they won't click on future podcast episodes. So for example, let's say there's news about a celebrity weight loss transformation. You'll title an episode literally titled "The Truth About Insert Celebrity Name Here, Weight Loss, What Works and What Doesn't." Another example, business coach, if there was big tech layoff news, how to recession proof your business after companies layoffs. Mindset coach, let's say there's a new controversial study on stress management, the science behind stress, what new study means for you. Now all we're doing at every single point is leveraging these hot and trending topics, right? Step number three, you have to move fast. Trending topics have super short lifespan and often last 48 to 72 hours before interest fades. Get your episodes, your videos, and your posts out as soon as possible while people are still searching for it. And make sure to use powerful hooks, which in this case really are your episode titles, to tie into the trending story to make your podcast way more discoverable. But wait, I want to make something super clear. We're not done yet. And here's why. So here's the key to turning newsjacking into sustainable long-term growth. While newsjacking is an incredible tool for driving immediate spikes in traffic and attracting new listeners, it only works long term, i.e. more consistent compounding growth month after month after month for your podcast, if you have a focused and strategic evergreen content foundation. Here's why. The role of newsjacking is simply to tap into timely opportunities, expanding your reach to a new audience who are searching for that topic right now. Whereas the evergreen content that you cover on your show, meaning the regular content you'll be covering on the podcast, that isn't about the news, it's not referencing something cultural, right? It's really to keep your listeners coming back for more, to nurture relationships long term. Because once a new listener discovers your podcast through, let's say, newsjacking episode, they need a reason to stay. Your evergreen content gives them a reason by offering consistent value, deep insights, binge-worthy content that speaks directly to their ongoing needs and interests. And if your podcast lacks a focused evergreen content, here's what happens. You get a temporary spike because you covered a timely relevant content, but no long-term growth. Listeners tune in for the trending topic, but they have no reason to stick around and binge past episodes because, again, it's not highly relevant and targeting them. Number 2, you'll attract the wrong audience. If your content is too broad, you'll get random listeners who will never come back because your other episodes aren't relevant to them. And you'll constantly stay stuck in this one-hit wonderland, going through these cycles, becoming essentially a news podcast where you're an entrepreneur, a business owner who's trying to generate more leads and sales for their podcast and wants to grow an audience, right? So you remain this one-hit wonder instead of seeing consistent audience growth. You're constantly chasing trends and stay invisible. You miss out on turning new listeners into loyal fans. Without binge-worthy content, new listeners don't subscribe, they won't follow, and they won't engage long-term. You waste time creating content that doesn't build real momentum. Every episode should work towards sustainable audience growth, not just a short-term visibility play. The bottom line is this, right? Newsjacking is a gateway to new listeners discovering your podcast, but your evergreen content is what keeps people coming back for more and builds a truly profitable and lasting podcast. And for this to work, i.e. the long-term evergreen content, you need to have a clear podcast targeting strategy. If your podcast is too broad, newsjacking might bring some new listeners in who will never return. But if you have a specific, clearly defined audience, the right listeners will stick around because they'll find all the other topics you've covered on the show highly relevant to them. And that's the secret to blowing up your podcast with newsjacking. I'll catch you in the next video. Peace.